On October 23, 1988, 41-year-old Peggy Carr was waitressing at a local restaurant in Alturas, Florida, when her heart suddenly began racing and her palms began to sweat. On March 3, 1989, about 5 months later, Peggy Carr would lose the fight with her sickness and passed away. The case remained a mystery until a brave undercover investigation into the strange illness and death of Peggy Carr revealed a sinister plot to take out an entire family.
An investigation starts from the center and works out, starts from the home and works out.
Peggy Carr and her family lived in Alturas, a small, closely knit community in Polk County, Florida. With a population of just over 4,000, Alturas is known for its peaceful ambiance and beautiful orange groves. Today, Alturas has a violent crime rate of 21.8%, lower than the national average of 22.7%. This makes it a relatively safer neighborhood than most communities in the U.S. But in 1988, when the events in today's case take place, Alturas was a much safer place. The type of place where leaving your front door open at night was not a problem, and neighbors looked out for each other. Born in 1947, Peggy Carr never had a life easy. Her parents were deaf and dirt poor, so from a young age she had to go out and find work that could put food on the table for her family. But with her minimal education, Peggy could hardly find any good jobs. The ones she did find paid extremely low or were very dangerous, like waitressing jobs at isolated truck stops on the highway. Still, she did her best to make ends meet and had a positive outlook. Peggy also developed a very tough personality to deal with the hazards of her job, such as drunken men looking to prey on a woman waitressing at an isolated spot in the middle of the night. Peggy's hard exterior made it almost impossible for her to find a romantic partner for a long time. But eventually, a man whose identity remains unknown would win her heart, and she would get married to him. Over the next couple of years, Peggy and her husband would have 3 children, Jelena, Alan, and Dwayne. The couple worked hard to provide for their family, and it seemed things were finally going right for Peggy. But soon, Peggy started to have issues with her husband, and before long, the marriage would come crashing down. By the mid-1980s, Peggy was in her mid-30s, a single mother working on jobs to raise 3 children. Although she tried to keep a positive attitude at work, Peggy grew increasingly sad and lonely. Life had been hard on her, and it just didn't seem like things would ever get better. As her kids grew up, they started to notice how sad and lonely their mother was, and they wished she would meet someone, fall in love, and be happy again. By late 1987, her children's wish came true. Peggy met a man named Perlin Carr, whom everyone called Pi. Pi, like Peggy, had recently divorced his wife. He also had 2 teenage children, and he worked at a local phosphate mining company in Alturas, Florida. Peggy and Pi hit it off when they met, mainly because they were both strict people who did not condone nonsense from others. When Peggy and Pi started dating, Peggy's children noticed a significant improvement in her mood. She was happier, lighter on her feet, and more relaxed. By April 1988, Peggy and Pi delighted their children with the news that they were getting married. Peggy and her 3 kids moved into Pi's home in Alturas, Florida after the wedding. Although Pi's home was small and 4 new people made it even tighter, the blended family seemed to work out well. The family had 2 big dogs, 5 children, got along well, and they were just happy to see their parents. But just a few months after they got married, Peggy and Pi began to have some marital issues. On top of their issues, Peggy had begun hearing rumors that Pi was still seeing his ex-wife, so they grew increasingly distant from each other. Around the time that Peggy and Pi's issues started, their 2 dogs suddenly became violently ill. They were howling in pain, losing weight rapidly, and their fur started falling out. It seemed like the dogs may have come down with a strange disease, or they might have ingested a poison. Before long, both dogs passed away, further plunging the Carr household into a gloomy atmosphere. Peggy and Pi continued to have daily issues that drove them further apart. In early October 1988, Peggy and her children had to move out of Pi's house for a week to stay at a motel because Peggy and Pi's fights had reached a point where they couldn't stand each other. The children also began taking sides with their respective parents, so the once happy family was now being torn apart. On October 23, 1988, Pi decided that he wanted to go on an unplanned hunting trip to get away for the day. Peggy and her kids had returned to the home by this time, so Peggy could be with the kids while Pi went on his trip. Once Pi left, Peggy and her daughter, Jelena, prepared to go to work. They were both waitresses at a local diner, and they had morning shifts on that particular day. As Peggy waited tables and attended to customers, she suddenly began to feel her heart racing erratically. That morning, Peggy was not doing any heavy lifting or stressful work. The only thing she was carrying were the trays holding customers' orders. Peggy thought she should just take it easy and her heart would stop beating so fast. And before long, she started to feel this tingling sensation in her arms and legs, and her palms started to sweat. Still wondering why she was feeling this way, it suddenly occurred to Peggy that she might be having a heart attack. But rather than panicking or becoming hysterical, Peggy tried to calm herself down. She went to the staff restroom and washed her face and hands, then slipped into the staff break room to relax for a bit. As she was relaxing, Jelena noticed that her mother had gone into the break room, so she went to check on her. Peggy calmly said she felt she might be having a heart attack and that she would go home and wait it out. Jelena was immediately alarmed at the idea that her mother could be having a heart attack, but she was not surprised at Peggy's calm demeanor. She knew Peggy was not fond of raising false alarms or panicking unnecessarily, so she believed if Peggy said she would sleep off a heart attack, then there wasn't anything to worry about. But she did make her mother promise that if she started feeling worse, then she would go to the hospital. Peggy informed the manager that she would be taking the rest of the day off because of how she was feeling, and Jelena promised to check up on her as soon as she finished her shift. When Peggy got home, she found the house empty. The kids were still at school and Pi was still away on his trip, so she went to her bedroom to lie down. After a few hours, Peggy's 17-year-old son, Dwayne, returned from school to find his mother lying in bed. The sight of Peggy taking a nap in the middle of the day was so strange to Dwayne that he immediately knew something was wrong. Peggy never took naps, not even when she was ill. With concern written all over his face, Dwayne asked Peggy if she was all right, and Peggy said she was. But just as he turned to leave the bedroom, Peggy suddenly blurted out she was not fine and felt horrible. She said that it felt like fire was being pumped through her arms and legs, and the pain was so blinding that she could barely even speak. At this, Dwayne's suspicions were confirmed. His mother was not a dramatic person, so if she said this was the most painful thing she had ever felt, Dwayne knew she had to get to the hospital immediately. Luckily, Pi returned home from his hunting trip just then, and Dwayne immediately told him that they had to take Peggy to the hospital immediately. But to his shock, Pi merely waved him off, saying that he was sure that Peggy was just suffering from the flu and she would be fine in a day or two. Dwayne immediately called his sister and asked her to return home so she could take Peggy to the hospital, since Pi was not planning on doing so himself. When Jelena arrived at the house, Dwayne had to carry Peggy to the car because her condition had gotten so bad that she could not even walk or stand. When they got to the hospital, Peggy was wheeled into the intensive care unit to begin receiving treatment. And this was where the real problem began, because neither Dwayne nor Jelena had any idea about what might have caused Peggy to feel the way she was. By now, Peggy could only lie down, moaning in pain. Her heart was still racing, her limbs still felt like they were on fire, and she was now nauseous and vomiting. The doctors ran a number of tests on Peggy, trying to determine what was wrong with her, but all the tests returned negative or showed nothing was wrong with her. This seriously baffled the doctors. Peggy was writhing in pain, and it seemed like her ailment came out of nowhere, because they could not find anything wrong with her from the tests they had run. With no better alternative, the doctor decided to keep her in the hospital and observe her. After about 3 days of being in the hospital, Peggy's symptoms seemed to improve. Although she felt bouts of extreme pain in her limbs, and her heart was still racing occasionally, she could now talk, eat, and move around a bit. Since she seemed to be on the mend, the doctors decided to discharge her so she could fully recuperate at home. When Peggy got home on October 26, 1988, she lay in bed to recover, and she felt herself improving. But within 24 hours, all the symptoms were back again, much stronger this time. Her arms and legs felt like they were on fire. Her heart was racing, she was nauseous, and she had lost so much weight that she looked like a shadow of herself. But rather than go to the hospital, Peggy's family knew that even the doctors had no idea what was wrong with her, so they thought it might be better for her to stay home. But right before their eyes, it seemed like Peggy was coming apart at the seams. She couldn't walk, talk, eat, or even sleep. She could only lay in bed writhing in pain and occasionally screaming into her pillow because of the intense pain she was feeling. Finally, on October 30th, her family relented and decided to take her to the hospital again. When Peggy arrived at the hospital, the doctors remembered her from the previous week and also remembered that they had been unable to determine the cause of her symptoms. But just to be sure they were leaving no stone unturned, the doctors decided to run another batch of tests on Peggy to see if they could find something they had earlier missed. They tested for food poisoning, thinking Peggy had ingested something tearing up her insides, and they tested for all the common diseases that might affect a 41-year-old woman, but the test results again showed nothing was wrong with Peggy. Once again, the doctors had no better alternative than to put Peggy in a room and observe her. As Peggy lay in her room, other patients and hospital staff could hear her screams of pure agony echo through the hospital halls. By October 31st, Peggy had begun slipping in and out of consciousness, but the situation was about to get even worse. Peggy's son Dwayne and Pi's son 16-year-old Travis were rushed into the same hospital that Peggy was at. They had suddenly begun suffering the same symptoms that Peggy had been suffering for over a week. Like Peggy, the doctors ran several tests on Dwayne and Travis to determine what was wrong with them, but they also came up with nothing. But suddenly, Dr. Robert Van Hook, one of the neurologists working on Peggy, noticed something about their symptoms that immediately stood out to him. Peggy, Dwayne, and Travis were losing their hair, and combined with the other symptoms they were feeling, the neurologist had a hunch that he knew the exact cause of their illness. But first, he sent for a very specific test kit to confirm his suspicions. When the test kit arrived, and the neurologist tested Peggy, Dwayne, and Travis, the test results were positive. All three had ingested a rare and expensive chemical called thallium-1 nitrate. Thallium-1 nitrate is a tasteless, colorless, odorless metal that was once used in rat poison, but was banned because of how toxic it was to humans. The average human has a small quantity of thallium in their system, but even the slightest increase in that naturally occurring amount can have fatal consequences, with symptoms like severe pain in the hands and legs, nausea, hair loss, weight loss, and erratic heartbeat. Peggy had 50,000 times the naturally occurring amount of thallium in her body, while Dwayne and Travis each had about 20,000 times that amount. Doctors decided to test the rest of the family, and they all had elevated levels of thallium in their system, though not as much as that of Peggy, Dwayne, and Travis. Before the test results, the doctors had not previously considered that Peggy and her son's cases were a potential crime. But with the test results showing that Peggy and her family may have been poisoned, they began to see the case in a new light. The hospital contacted the Polk County Sheriff's Office to let them know about the case and the fact that there was a potential crime at play there. Nobody knew where Peggy and her boys had come into contact with such a rare and expensive chemical. Was it accidental, or were they deliberately poisoned? While the police began their investigation, things looked grim for Peggy. Although there was a cure for thallium poisoning, Peggy's body had been so completely ravaged by the poison that even if treatment had been administered, she would not likely survive. Doctors told her that the only thing they could do was to make her as comfortable as possible while they waited for the poison to take her life. But there was hope for the boys. They could begin receiving treatment, and everyone hoped it would be fast enough to save their lives. A few days after Peggy received the news that she could not be saved, she slipped into a coma. She would remain in the coma for the next 4 months, until March 3, 1989, when her family decided to take her off life support. After spending 2 months in the hospital, Dwayne made a full recovery. Travis would remain hospitalized for 6 months before eventually recovering from the poisoning. But tragically, he could never walk again because of the extreme damage the poison had caused to his limbs. For Sheriff Judd from the Polk County Sheriff's Office, Peggy and her son's case was very delicate, regardless of whether they were intentionally poisoned. If someone had poisoned them, they had a murder and several attempted murders on their hands, and a killer at large. If they had ingested the poison by accident, then there was the likelihood that the source of the poison was still out there for other Alturas residents to ingest. Either way, the stakes were high, so Sheriff Judd was determined to get to the bottom of it. Investigators tested every single item and surface in the Carr house for thallium, but all the results came back negative. Meanwhile, as news got out that the Carr family had been poisoned, and the police did not know where the poison came from, Panic began to spread throughout Alturas. People were afraid that the poison might have come from their groundwater, or that they could even already be dying and not know about it. So investigators examined the car's well water, which was connected to at least 2 other houses, but they found nothing. Also, no one else in the community had come down with the symptoms that Peggy and her sons suffered. At this point, Prosecutor John Aguero from the Florida State's Attorney's Office joined the investigation and started to look into pesticides, insecticides, or any other plant spray where thallium might have come from. Alturas had many orange groves, and there might have been thallium in the chemicals used to preserve the trees. But the test results all came back negative. While scouring the car house to find what Peggy and her sons could have eaten or drank that could have contained the poison, police discovered their first break in the case, an 8-pack of Coca-Cola bottles with lids that had been tampered with. They immediately sent the bottles for testing, and when the results came back, it showed that the Coca-Cola bottles had high levels of thallium. Someone had put thallium inside the drinks and then replaced the covers. The first obvious lead was that this had become a case of product tampering from the bottling company's end. If it was, there could be a national thallium poisoning crisis, because practically everyone drank Coca-Cola. When Alturas residents heard about this new lead, many became scared of drinking Coke. However, as the investigation proceeded, it came out that the poisoning did not come from the bottling company or the stores that sold Coca-Cola in Alturas. This led investigators to one chilling conclusion. The bottles had been tampered with, but it had been done by someone who deliberately targeted the Carr family. The prime suspect was Pi Carr himself. On October 23rd, the day Peggy had begun experiencing the symptoms, Pi had suddenly decided to go on a hunting trip that kept him away for most of the day. Investigators believed this might have been the way of trying to cover his tracks. There was also the fact that Pi worked at a phosphate mining company, so he could have access to a chemical as expensive and rare as thallium. Coupled with the fact that Peggy and Pi had begun having marital issues, it seemed very plausible that Pi was the one who poisoned Peggy. However, this theory had some loopholes. Pi and his children had also tested positive for thallium poisoning, meaning they drank from the Coke that Peggy and her children drank. So if Pi truly wanted Peggy dead, it seemed more realistic that he would have planned it in such a way that she was the only one who ingested the poison. Or at least he would have made sure that his children did not ingest it. Still, police brought Pi in for questioning. Pi told them that he knew nothing about how the poison got into his home, swearing that the hunting trip was coincidental. As he was talking, he mentioned something offhandedly that did not seem like a big deal then. But when police followed up on Pi's tip, they would find the next big clue to help them piece this puzzling case together and discover who had poisoned Peggy and her family. As Pi sat in the interrogation room trying to defend himself, he suddenly remembered something that happened a few weeks before Peggy fell ill. Peggy's son, Dwayne, had gone to check the mail one day when he found a printed note addressed to Pi. The note read, "You and your so-called family have exactly 2 weeks to move out of the state of Florida, or you will all die. This is no joke." At the time, Peggy and Pi dismissed the death threat as a prank by some mischievous teenagers. But now that the entire family had been poisoned, it seemed that the note might not have been a joke. It might have been from the person who poisoned the Carrs. As police began investigating the note, they noticed a few things that immediately told them that whoever had sent the note knew Pi and his family well. For example, the sender had spelled Pi's name correctly as P-Y-E rather than P-I-E, as most people would spell it. Armed with this new lead, police began interviewing hundreds of Alturas residents, trying to find out who might have had a reason to hate the Carrs and want them dead. But in a small and closely knit community like Alturas, neighbors looked out for each other. Police could not find a single person with a motive to hurt the Carrs, so they decided to ask FBI Special Agent Mark Young, a profiler with hundreds of cases under his belt, to help build a profile of the likely perpetrator of this crime. Agent Young believed that a person using poison to kill was likely someone who had been wronged and wanted to correct the wrong they believed had been done to them. Also, the specific type of thallium used to poison the Coca-Cola bottles was the unnoticeable type. It was expensive, not something you could pop into the store and buy.
The poisoner often feels like that they've been wronged and wants to correct what they perceive as something that's been done to them or is aggravating them.
This showed that the perpetrator was intelligent, with a significant knowledge of chemistry. With this in mind, investigators ruled out suspects until they reached the Carr's neighbors, George Trappell and his wife Diana Carr. George Trappell was born on January 23, 1949. He was a chemist and computer programmer with multiple degrees. His wife, Diana Carr, who had no relationship with Pye Carr, was a successful orthopedic surgeon with a private practice in Alturas. While Diana had a very strong personality and was more outgoing, George was a quiet man who barely left the house, but he wasn't always so laid back. In the 1970s, when George was a student at Clemson University, South Carolina, he was fond of doing drugs and was always willing to share his substances with others, with or without their consent. George and his friends formed a habit of picking up hitchhikers and giving them drug-laced brownies or cookies just to see how they would react. In 1975, he got sentenced to 3 years in federal prison for running a large methamphetamine or meth lab. An interesting thing about George's meth cooking process was that one of the byproducts was thallium. George also had a habit of studying police manuals. He considered himself an expert on crime scene procedures. George and Diana were not exactly the best neighbors to live with. They always had problems with Peggy and Pye and their children, from complaining that they were laughing or playing music too loud, to complaining that their dogs were barking too loud. Diana and George found the Carrs annoying and obnoxious, and although Peggy tried to be amicable, they were never on good terms. Diana especially hated the Carrs and would always complain about them. George, on the other hand, seemed nicer. He smiled and waved at them and did not complain as much as his wife did. But secretly, George hated the Carrs as much as his wife did. In March 1988, George reported Pye to the local zoning board for violating zoning laws, as he had tried to convert his garage into an apartment for his stepdaughter Jelena and her baby girl. 2 days before Peggy fell sick, Diana stormed to the Carr house to complain as usual. When they told her off, she left shouting, "You won't get away with this. This isn't over." Aside from being very successful in their respective fields, George and Diana were very intelligent people. So intelligent that they were members of a prestigious organization called Mensa. Mensa was founded in 1946 by a barrister named Roland Barrell and his friend Dr. Lance Ware. It is an exclusive club for people who fall within the upper 2% of the general population in a special IQ test and are highly intelligent. To gain entry into Mensa, applicants have to pass a series of special IQ tests, and even passing those tests does not always guarantee admission into the club. When they do get admitted, members regularly hold meetings, discussion panels, debates, seminars, and other hangouts to share ideas and engage in stimulating conversation. Although Mensa was originally based in England, it has branches worldwide. The Florida chapter of Mensa, to which George and Diana belong, regularly held monthly fun, mentally stimulating meetings called Murder Mystery Weekend. Members would take turns planning a crime mystery that the rest of the members would try to solve for an entire weekend. For that weekend, all the members would go to a secluded location, like an inn or hotel, where they would stay and play their parts in solving the murder mystery. In April 1989, a few weeks after Peggy's death, the Mensa Florida chapter welcomed a new member, a middle-aged woman named Sherry Gwen. Sherry had moved to Florida after escaping an abusive marriage in Texas. Once she joined Mensa, she found a sense of community and immediately became close with George and Diana. The month that Sherry joined Mensa was George and Diana's turn to plan the murder mystery that would be solved for that month's Murder Mystery Weekend. George, now 40 years old, took this role very seriously, and he spent weeks trying to create the perfect crime. Their Murder Mystery Weekend was very successful, as all the members had a hard time trying to solve the crime and identify the murder weapon. But when George finally disclosed the murder weapon to the group, Sherry became fascinated. She would spend hours talking to George about it, trying to learn everything he knew about the murder weapon and how it would play out if it were used in real life. George, who was often overshadowed by his wife, was flattered with the attention he received from Sherry, and he was happy to answer all her questions. In December 1989, Diana moved her medical practice from Alturas to a neighboring town called Sebring, so she and George decided to move there too. When Sherry heard about it, she immediately asked if she could rent their house since they weren't selling it yet. As soon as Sherry moved into the house, almost the entire Alturas Police Department descended upon the house. Sherry Gwen was not in fact a divorced woman, but fled Texas after escaping an abusive marriage. Her real name was Susan Gorick, and she was an undercover policewoman assigned to investigate George Turpel and Diana Carr. During their initial investigation, police interviewed George. Although he seemed meek and reserved, when asked if he knew anybody who would want to hurt the Carrs, he said, "Someone must have wanted them to move out of the neighborhood." This statement echoed the death threat Pye had received weeks before Peggy fell ill. When police discovered the altercations between the Turpels and Carrs, their suspicion of George grew. Additionally, he fit the FBI profile for the perpetrator, a white, extremely intelligent male with a passive personality who avoided conflict. So, Susan Gorick had been assigned to investigate them undercover. When Susan discovered that the murder weapon George used to plan his murder mystery was thallium poisoning, she knew George was most likely the killer. Also, the pamphlet he printed describing the murder in this mystery read, "When a death threat appears on the doorstep, prudent people throw out all their food and watch what they eat. Hardly anyone dies from magic. Most items on the doorstep are just a neighbor's way of saying, 'I don't like you. Move or else.'" So as soon as he and Diana left their house, she called for backup and ordered a search of the house. In the garage, the police found a treasure trove of chemicals, including thallium. They also discovered that George often brewed his own beer, so he had machines to remove bottle covers and replace them. Investigators determined that George had finally had enough of his neighbors, so he decided to get rid of them. He fit the profile, had the means and motive to commit the crime, and had the opportunity to sneak a case of Coca-Cola into the Carrs' kitchen. Alturas was a community where people hardly ever locked their doors, and casually strolling by to say hello to a neighbor was normal. With all this evidence, the police had enough to bring George in for questioning. When George arrived at the Alturas police station, he appeared shy and avoided eye contact with the officers interviewing him. But faced with all the evidence, he maintained that he had nothing to do with the poisoning, but investigators were not buying it. On April 5, 1990, Turpel was indicted on 1 count of first-degree murder, 6 counts of attempted first-degree murder, 7 counts of poisoning food or water, and 1 count of tampering with a consumer product. In January 1991, George went on trial for these 15 criminal counts, including first-degree murder, 6 counts of attempted murder, poisoning food or water, and product tampering. After a trial that lasted for 4 weeks, from January 7th to February 7th, 1991, the jury returned a guilty verdict against George on all counts. He was sentenced to death. Today, George remains on death row at the Union Correctional Institution in Railford, Florida. George has filed several appeals challenging the FBI's investigation procedure and the credibility of the state's witnesses, but all his appeals have been denied. Diana Carr was never charged with anything. She would eventually divorce George in 1996 and remarry. Peggy's children, Alan, Jelena, and Dwayne, have since moved on. Knowing the evil mastermind who killed their mother, paralyzed their stepbrother Travis, and nearly killed Dwayne, has been made to face the law. Peggy's life was very difficult for a long time, and just when things were about to start getting good for her, her life was violently snatched by a neighbor who just didn't like her and her family. At least her family can move on, knowing she got justice. But do you think Diana Carr should have also been charged with murder, or at least attempted murder? Let us know in the comments. If there is any case you'd like us to cover in the next episode, drop your suggestion in the comment section. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to this channel for more.